Good evening. Welcome to Vaclav Havel Library and welcome to Havel Channel. We also have an online audience tonight, so I'm glad we have a good presence here and also online, hopefully. This is the first of the evenings with Radio Free Europe, organized by Vaclav Havel Library. And we will dedicate this evening to the pressing subject of safety of journalists. We will look into the risk people in media face today, and we will try to explain why it matters for all of us, although we are merely consumers of media. Vaclav Havel Library is an important platform providing space and opportunities for discussions on a variety of issues linked to human rights, liberty, democracy, and rule of law, the values that Václav Havel stood up for his entire life as a dissident and as president. I'm very glad we are opening this series with this subject that is related, except of safety of journalists, also to the very important issue of freedom of information that really matters to us all. This evening is co-hosted by Radio Free Europe. Radio remained one of the scarce sources of information, of true information for all of us living behind the Iron Curtain for most of the time until the late 1980s. RFE-RL has moved its headquarters to Prague in 1995, and President Václav Havel played an important role in this decision. Nowadays, RFE-RL broadcasts in 27 languages to 23 countries. It has 21 local bureaus and over 500 core staff and 1,300 stringers and freelancers, and I believe too many of them are working in very risky conditions as we speak. I'd like to welcome my guests for this evening. First of all, Stephen Kapus, President and CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in charge of this media house since 1st of January. Since 1st of January this year. After being around for several years, I believe, as a strategic and manager advisor, and also a consultant to current time. Steve had a rich career of an award-winning producer and media manager, and also as a journalist for many years before he took up his mission in Radio Free Europe. Lida Vacková is representing Freedom House. She is a manager for Emergency Assistance Program, and her daily job for years has been literally to save people from risky conditions, human rights defenders, journalists, and activists coming under threat because of their work for the sake of human rights and protecting liberties of their fellow citizens. Lida is also a member of Journalists in Distress, a network of 26 organizations working on saving journalists from difficult, risky, and life-threatening situations. Martin Řezníček is a deputy chief news editor in Czech Public Television, a reporter and a presenter. He's gained recognition, among others, as a US correspondent of the Czech television in 2012-2017. Prior to that, he also served as a chief foreign editor, which is quite relevant for our today's subject of safety of those that make media and risk to bring to their audience unbiased information and real-time account of events from the ground, from where they are actually happening. And I'm Gabriela Svárovská, and I will be your host tonight. So, For over a decade, press freedom is declining globally. Each day, journalists around the world are being intimidated and attacked for doing their work. The threats and risky situations vary from, let's say, traditional, like violence, to technology-based, that includes surveillance and online harassment. I would like us today to bring stories of courageous journalists and also to touch upon the question why we should care and what can we actually do to make sure that
But he is also the husband of one of our imprisoned colleagues, also is this evening being detained in Russia and has been, the crime that she committed, I'll put crime in quotes, was that she went to visit her ailing mother. When she went to leave, she was stopped. And this evening she's in a prison cell while Pavel and their two lovely daughters are here in Prague. Pavel also is an American citizen, which should afford her certain rights and other opportunities. But this evening, we're doing everything we can to secure her freedom, but it's already been too long. It's been more than 150 days now, and there's no end in sight, sadly. Three of Valsu's colleagues from Radio Free Europe are also imprisoned this evening, two in Belarus and one in Crimea. What we see is the authoritarian's playbook being passed around from one place to another, to another, to another. And what's happening is journalists, I think the safest thing is to say is that journalists are awfully good at doing what we do. And that, as President Havel, I'm going to say that several times tonight, but when the President spoke about living in truth, the journalists have become quite good about even getting around difficult situations and doing their jobs. And we're so good at it that they do extreme measures to silence our journalists. And we enjoy the support of Freedom House. We enjoy the support of other public service broadcasters. In fact, journalist organizations all around the world have come to the support of Radio Free Europe as we've worked to secure the freedom for our people. And I would say that this is a time to set aside the usual competitive nature of our business and get behind people who are devoted to doing accurate reporting. And this is what we stand for. But we can't do it alone. And so I think this is a vitally important subject, and we could probably spend days and days just talking about issues of press safety and freedom, but it's an incredibly important subject.
Thank you very much. Lida, your emergency assistance program is global. So you have quite a good overview of what are the risks that journalists face worldwide. What are, in general, the reasons why they are silenced, including, in your opinion, what are globally the biggest risks that journalists and media workers face, as you see it?
Well, emergency assistance program was initially focusing on human rights defenders and activists, and increasingly, we saw by the applications and inquiries received that journalists are approaching us more and more often. And I would say that, as Stephen was mentioning, this is a kind of like a lakmus paper of showing that they're really good in their job. That's why they are more and more targeted. I think that, and I apologize that we are kind of like a grim group of people here, like, not really giving you, like, too much of a good news. So I will try to balance it a little bit. But we see the increase in applications. We see also that the threats are unfortunately becoming more, as Gabriela was mentioning, traditional. Suddenly it's more of a physical violence, intimidation, harassment, comparing to, let's say, 5-10 years ago when it was equipment replacement, or it was medical assistance, or temporary internal relocation. Nowadays, it's more about permanent one-way ticket, as we call it, relocation abroad, because journalists really realize that they simply are not able to stay in their country and continue their work. So they may be more helpful, and they can keep working and supporting their colleagues, like, who are still in their countries. I would say that, of course, like, as the world is changing, like, the digital threats is something on a rise as well. You maybe touch a little bit later on SLAP. That's a big thing, in especially so-called more safe part of the, say, cultural norms that journalists covering the topics which are not traditional in their countries are becoming targeted for these. It doesn't matter if it's religion, or if it's ethnicity, or it's sexual identity, or it's sexual orientation. These are the new topics which, for example, respected media or journalists in the past suddenly, like, touched and became unpopular or targeted. And again, it's targeting not only by state actors, non-state actors, criminal groups, but unfortunately also by the family members or the neighbors, because this is something new. And we see that, unfortunately, attacks on journalists are kind of normalized. You can very often hear, like, a comment, what they were expecting? They're journalists, they're troublemakers. And I think that, like, part of our mission is not only to be reactive, in a sense that once the emergency happens, like, we are there to assist the person, media outlet, but also trying to find the ways, like, how to be proactive. Building some networks, preparing some security plans. And this is extremely important in these days. So sometimes, even, like, before we receive the application from individual or the media outlet, we already are aware that something like this will be happening, and we are trying, like, proactively to, let's say, at least secure the minimum for the person or the outlet. So yes, this is a grim picture, but I would say that with the increase of the threats and varieties of the threats, you can also see the increase of networking, of sharing the contribute to strengthening that support and solidarity.
So these are the coping strategies, and perhaps also public or media consumers, the audience, can actually think about playing a role in this. I'm afraid we are going to continue in this grim picture for some time. Martin, the Czech Republic is a free country, which doesn't necessarily mean journalists are safe, completely safe, and they are not pushed to give up on their stories because someone doesn't like the story, or they step into the territory of someone powerful. So what's your assessment? Are journalists safe in this country or not?
Good evening. I would say that more or less they are, probably unless you're a Russian journalist in exile with the FSB security octopus being omnipresent wherever you move. But on journal, I mean, I would say they are, if you, especially relatively to journalists fighting for just being able to do their job in Ukraine, in Russia, in Gaza, and elsewhere. But even in democracies, as you rightly pointed out, we are being harassed. And it's always, I am biased, I'm a journalist, and talking about journalism is not neutral. But I'll bring up one little story from my time when I was in the United States as Czech TV correspondent. I was there while covering many of the election rallies of Mr. Trump. And imagine you're the crowd of his sympathizers who came out and came out to support him. We are here as journalists covering the story. And you have, in the back, you have a stage of Mr. Trump. Well, it had never happened to me that we would be somewhere covering a rally, covering anything basically, an event, that the attention would be completely changed 180 degrees from the stage of Mr. Trump, by Mr. Trump, towards us. And you know, his sympathizers, everyone who came out to that rally, basically began shouting at us, you know, fake news and all those words that Mr. Trump used to say, and he's still using them. So suddenly we became the target of their attention. And when we were leaving, people were, you know, shouting at us and calling us out just because we had a camera and a microphone in our hand. And you know, this country, the great country of the United States, often characterized as the beacon of democracy, with 2.5 centuries of uninterrupted democracy, you have journalists being harassed that way, that simple way. That happens to us here as well, not at rallies, not that much, although to a certain extent as well. When we report on some anti-government rallies in the Wenceslav Square, for example, we have to be reporting from above, from a balcony. Not only it gives you a great vantage point, but also it protects you from people being nasty to you. Whenever we have a live shot, people shout at us, you know, saying that we lie about this rally. Well, we're there to cover the rally, right? We're not there to lie about the rally, and people can see it. Often in Parliament, for example, especially with our female journalists, female Czech TV reporters, it happens to them that they're being attacked by these kind of piercing, not physically, but piercing attacks by some of the members of Parliament saying, you know, are you pregnant? You look different. You know, you change your color. Do you think it's really better than the previous color? This is what they're doing. Not all, but many of those. And when they come back, they complain about this, right? This is a subtle way, not so subtle, I would say, to harass you, to tell you, you know what, you're not doing your job right, and we should concentrate on what you look like instead of what you're doing. And so these are not physical attacks against journalists, but very frightening as well. And they're happening in, you know, in an EU country, in, I would say, semi-developed country in the middle of Europe.
It can be pretty unpleasant, and definitely it influences someone's, you know, ability to be, you know, objective and calm and really focus on the course of events instead of the attacks, because it's emotionally disrupting, right? I'm wondering, you know, what has gone wrong in all this? We wanted to name several brave and courageous journalists, and I can't forget about Daphne Caruana Galizia, a Maltese journalist that was murdered in 2017 for her work on Panama Papers, as well as the Slovak investigative journalist Jan Kuciak that was murdered with his partner a year later. And Czech Republic also had a case of a hitman hired to kill an investigative journalist, Sabina Slonková, years ago. Journalists operate literally on the front line of the fight against corruption, abuse of power, and organized crime, but also, you know, regular political developments and events of the day. So I would like you to think or tell me, what do you think went wrong? What are the mechanisms that failed so that these journalists I mentioned couldn't be protected, but also the journalists that are being intimidated have to face those situations. They are not being perceived as people providing service to us all, but a target.
Well, I think, excuse me, I think that Martin's answer touched on one of the fundamental issues here, which is we're seeing authoritarian figures all around the planet, frankly, use words like enemies of the people to describe a working journalist. We're seeing more and more legal proceedings being brought against journalists. And what I'd say, a couple things that, you know, I would say to anybody who cherishes their individual freedoms, or growing up or living in a society where these things are important, don't take those freedoms for granted. They are at risk. They can be taken away at any given time. So we like to have people who are fixated on what's happening all around them. You know, this morning I met with the woman who should be the president of Belarus. And
I met her too today.
And she's an extraordinary woman. And I think if you look at what's happening in Belarus right now, you know, there's no such thing as freedom of information, freedom of the press. Her husband is in prison. She hasn't not had any contact with him for a year now. And that's why I say that these freedoms should not ever be taken for granted. And we should hold people who are in power, hold them accountable. Because it becomes very easy for somebody to start doing what we're seeing in some of the countries where we operate. Here's one of the playbooks. First, as journalists' accreditation come up, they stop issuing accreditations. And so suddenly it becomes illegal to ask a question as a working journalist. Asking a question is illegal in some of the places where our people are working these days. And then what happens is, well, they say, well, you asked a question, you're not accredited, so we're going to either kick you out or put you in a different situation. In some cases, you know, like in some Central Asian countries, we've relocated some of the people who used to be in Afghanistan. So if they get kicked out of Central Asia, where are they going to go? You know, and we've had to move people all around the area. But this is the playbook, and they know that they can go after legal, they can go after livelihoods, they can go after family members. And it's not just physical intimidation. We're also talking about a world in which they're attacked, cyber attacks take place, and it's just an endless, it's an extraordinary amount of energy that they're expending to just simply shut down journalists from accurately reporting what's going on. And imagine all of those resources poured into good or returning them for people who live inside these places. When I've seen, you know, what took place, you know, it's interesting, you know, when Navalny's death became known to the world, our reporting drew enormous audiences from all around the world, including inside Russia. And some of the very journalists who still operate at great risk to just show pictures of people laying flowers at his grave and then suddenly being arrested for doing so. Well, those images don't just magically appear. There are still people who are committed to trying to let the world know what's going on. But you know, we hear it all the time that, well, how did it get this bad? It's very difficult to fight it when it gets to that point, and like as it has in Russia, like in places like the United States and others where we should cherish these freedoms. I too worry about kind of the trends and things that are going on. Journalists are not the enemies of the people; they're the advocates for the people, and that's why they're so powerful against you know, people who don't want the truth to be known.
Would any of you like to elaborate a little bit more on the analysis, like what went wrong? Why people now perceive Czech television or other public service media or media in general as a threat you know, as some, why people are, you know, turning to sources of plain disinformation, and they then, you know, become psychologically wretched, and they just think, oh, this is now my source of information. What is it, you would say, is behind? What is it behind? I mean, what is it that made this happen?
I may just very briefly mention, and I already mentioned it before, like, you know, this normalization of everything, basically. You know, like, everyone can say, oh, but this is your truth, or, you know, this is your fact. Everything is relative. My source says something different. And it goes really back to the core of understanding what is the role of the journalism, and also, like, you know, that what is our responsibility as consumers of the journalism, you know, the media literacy, let's say, some rational thinking, like, you know, even when I'm reading the news from the outlet or media I kind of trust, I don't trust anyone 100%, but I'm still trying, like, you know, to check that particular information from other sources. And sometimes it's remarkable to somehow, like, understand that in the 21st century, you are, like, questioning every news, every information way more than in the 20th century. Because it's kind of like the world and time we're living in is a blessing, but also a curse. And the freedom and the freedom of expression and democracy is not granted. You know, like, we all are in really, we really need to more focus on processing the information, sharing the information, understanding that when we comment something or when we are sharing it further, like, you know, there are consequences. And I think that people forgot about that. You know, I think that sometimes, like, we are still consuming the information, and even the role of the journalists, like back in the 90s, you know, these are the cool guys going to the war zones, like, you know, or reporting, like, you know, from, let's say, some interesting parts of the world. But journalists are also exposing to us that not everything is ideal in our own societies. And this is uncomfortable kind of, like, situation to be at when you're reading that corruption is on a rise, rule of law is not really that great, in that great shape. And I think that it's a mixture of feeling that, you know, like, people forgot that the journalists are only sharing, like, you know, the state of the society. They're not blaming, you know, us. They are sharing the information so something can be improved. But again, you know, the truth is usually the uncomfortable one. And I think that it is really important to also understand, I've seen that, like, 2-3 years ago, when it started to be more of a trend to support, like, you know, some smaller media outlets or individual journalists, you know, and they were like, I'm not gonna pay for this article. And I was like, yeah, but, like, you know, that person, you know, they also need to pay the rent, you know, that it's their job, you know, they need to earn money so they can continue working as journalists. And for people, like, you know, and maybe that's just the Central European mindset, but they believe that journalists should just do it for free and on the highest standards. And I think that it's a failure of the society as well, you know. And of course, then you have authoritarian countries, you know, where they just basically, like, you know, are sharing the lessons learned between themselves very well. Like, you know, if this worked in Azerbaijan, let's try it in Belarus. Like, you know, if that worked in Belarus, for sure it will work in Nicaragua. And this is a global kind of, like, sharing, not even experiment. This is a mechanism, like, which works globally. And I think that, like, you know, as the so-called bad guys are sharing their experience, us, like, let's hope the good guys are like also sharing some experience in empowering and supporting the journalists.
Now, only good guys are invited to talk at the Vaclav Havel Library. Don't. Before I ask or let Martin speak, because I'm particularly interested what he has to say on behalf of the Czech television, on behalf of the Czech journalists, and also perhaps on behalf of the kind of European journalism community, because you're representing the Czech television at the European Broadcasting Union, I would like to invite you to think of your questions, because in some 5 minutes I will open the floor to the questions from the audience, because they might be way more interesting than mine. So.
There's one point, or maybe a couple of points that I'd like to make. The reason why journalists are not being as trusted as maybe in the past, there's a certain level of insecurity among people. Globalization has not been kind to everyone. The spread of social media, unfiltered, with no editorial control whatsoever. Everyone now has his or her voice heard, and people don't have that immunity that we used to have. People are not immune to disinformation. It's all coming through our skin, and I think this is one of many factors why people just try to dispute and doubt everything that they hear. Not that they shouldn't, but they have to have some handlers, right? They have to handle on to something at least. They have to have some media that they trust. Trust but verify, but more than others. And it seemed to me like people very often are just lost. And they take their frustration, and then public service media or bona fide journalists in general are just lightning rods for their worries. And it happens very often to us as well. The other thing is that politicians, some of them, not all of them, complain about what we do in a very nasty way. I mean, I personally, I'm not going to talk too much about myself, but I received death threats as well in following the presidential debate that I had the privilege of presenting last January. And there was a wave after wave of these attacks, and then it kind of went down, but when it plummeted, it was awful. I didn't read it. I deleted all the emails. But yes, then you think twice, are you doing your job the way that it should be done? We talk about this very often with our European colleagues on the EBU level. So remember, public service TV and radio stations across Europe. In the Netherlands, for example, they took all the labels of NOS, which is their public service media, off their satellite WANs when they go cover rallies, because they're afraid of being attacked. So they have only white WANs. So they cannot even say out loud that we're representing this particular media. So they're there. We know, and everyone knows that they're from NOS, but they cannot say it out loud. They just try to be, kind of deemed independent. So, these are just a couple of instances of how the journalist environment is changing, and not in a particularly good way.
Speaking of the changing, just keep the microphone. Speaking of the changing environment, I'm wondering, there is the pressure from outside, there's the pressure from inside. Should I really report this story because it will bring me yet another wave of hatred, whatever? And there is this, abundance of information. We are overwhelmed, and the journalist must be overwhelmed as well. So, just take the terrorist attack that happened in Moscow recently. So there were immediately, versions available. So how do you navigate? Because I'm asking about this because I feel like, I'm used to analyze information and work with information, but, I very often feel overwhelmed myself. And I think this is the very important service that media and journalists are providing to us. They help us navigate through this, damp of, information of very different quality.
Well, I'll be really brief. I had a mentor at BBC about almost 3 decades ago in London, Mark Brain, and he told me that journalism is the sole profession that enables you to ask anyone, anything, anytime. You know, I usually attach, apart from police, they're entitled to this as well. And I believe in what I do because I trust my colleagues, I trust the brand, I trust the profession. And I see it as, I don't want to make it too kind of fluffy, but I see it as a mission. We're here to inform because people are not being able to be there, right? We're the voices, we're the eyes and we're the ears of the population. We're serving them. This is a service. And I love my service. So that gives me the fuel.
I just want to say something real quick, just amplifying on Martin's point, which is journalists have a responsibility. You talked about the information overload and how it just feels some days it's just too much. But there's also a short attention span. And journalists at their worst will blame the audience for that. And I think we in the journalism profession have a responsibility as well to do everything we can to make people not forget what's going on. You know, here we are, you know, more than 2 years into the full-on invasion in Ukraine, and the story's falling off of the front pages. It's falling further and further behind. Why is that? Obviously, it's still obviously of immense importance, but how you cover the stories can dictate, in some ways, how long you keep people hooked. So we have a responsibility to do creative storytelling, to make people care. You began this event by talking about individual stories. Well, you know, when you start talking about individuals and what they're up against all around the world, suddenly it becomes more relevant. And I do think that having that front and center is really important.
The testimony, sort
Yeah.
of. Are there any questions ready? Yes. I'll ask the microphone for Jolyon Nakele, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you. I find this a fascinating discussion, having been through this myself in the 80s and the 90s. And some things don't change, and some things seem to be getting actually worse and worse. It's important to have a historical context. History didn't begin in 1989 or in 2000 or 99 or whatever. Journalists have been banned and harassed for as long as they've been journalists. And I felt it on my skin, and I saw how this country treated foreign correspondents and domestic reporters in the 80s. I was followed around throughout Eastern Europe, in Russia in the late 80s when people told me, oh, that's not possible, foreign reporters don't get followed around here anymore. I was with RFE, RL at the time. But yes, they did it. And I also sought out a balcony on Wenceslas Square during the demonstrations in the late 1980s because it was the only safe place. But the difference is that then it was the state versus journalists. And now, as you've rightly pointed out, it's also members of the public, elements in the public. What's changed is that in the 80s, there was a dearth of information. There was a shortage. There was no free flow of information in the Soviet bloc, and the public was dependent either on state media or foreign media to find out what was going on. And they were not the ones who were going to attack reporters. It was state representatives, the police, the foreign ministry press department that would warn, bar, ban, expel. Now you have a free flow of information, and people don't read newspapers, people don't, the majority, let's say, don't read newspapers, don't watch the evening news. They get their information, whether in pubs or on social media, and far too many people are not able to judge anymore what is the truth. Unfortunately, we saw after the fall of communism that there were certain politicians in Czechoslovakia in the early 90s who contributed actually to the breakup through their manipulation of the media. Václav Klaus, who said about me, I don't want this person ever to ask me a question when I'm in the room again. Vladimir, etc.
Did he say it to you as well? Did he say it to you as well?
He didn't say it to me, he said it to his aides. Don't let that guy ever ask me a question again. And in those days, you know, Klaus was almost God for a large portion of the public here. Today he's a joke, but 30 years ago he wasn't. So, in the late 80s and still in the early 90s, there was a tool to shame, publicly and privately shame, police states, totalitarian states that were not moving in the right direction, and that was called the CSCE, subsequently the OSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, where Western diplomats, ambassadorial level or above, would publicly shame this country, that country, for their treatment of journalists. That doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. I mean, OSCE exists, but it's just another international organization. So I'd like to hear from you, is it possible to actually shame Russia, Turkmenia, or any police state that so abuses the rights or limits the rights and privileges of journalists? Because my impression is that there is no longer a functional forum to do that. I mean, yes, you can do it in the media, but they just blow it off.
So the question is about the options.
How do you
shame? How do you shame? How do you shame dictators, autocrats, and everyone who calls to disrespect or harassment of journalists?
I love the word, actually, shaming them. I think that in our work we are calling it international pressure these days, which we can all question how efficient it is. From my own experience, working in this field for over 15 years, targeted sanctions, specific stories, and specific cases, diplomatic pressure, sometimes behind the doors, like, you know, when we are not even sure what the deal was, but, like, you know, then the journalist is released. But unfortunately, we have a lot of public figures and politicians who are very good in shaming journalists and journalistic work. We do not have that many political figures or even, I think, like, famous people or like actors or, like, you know, just some other VIPs, so-called, who would be shaming exactly these actions against the journalists. So I think, again, it goes to the solidarity campaigns, raising awareness. And yes, of course, like, you know, in ideal world, that would be enough that Lukashenko, Putin, you know, or others would be like, oh my God, like, you know, I'm hated, I'm disrespected, like, you know, there's a whole world, like, you know, really looking at me, like, you know, that I'm this dictator. Yeah, I don't think they care. But I think that at least, like, you know, in these specific cases of imprisoned journalists or for example, like right now, the One World Film Festival is happening, and this Azerbaijani media outlet, Abzas Media, were awarded a Homo Homini Award last week. And yes, it might be something small for, like, you know, general citizens of Azerbaijan, but it gives some publicity to those shame these perpetrators. But I think that raising awareness, solidarity, and those diplomatic individual actions, this is something what works.
But there's actually a bit of a good news, I'm realizing, because Jolyon said that during communism there was no freedom of speech and there were no free media and there were no journalists reporting really, to their audiences in countries like Czechoslovakia. And Lida brought the example of Abzas Media, which shows that even in dark places like Azerbaijan, people can actually do investigative journalism. Most of the team ended up in prison, which is very bad, but at least, the option was there for them to, stand up and write about, how the first family of the country is stealing from everyone and how it's bribing politicians worldwide to actually make their way to international fora. So maybe there's a bit of a good news in, the opportunities that, internet brought us. However, dark is the other side of the same coin. Another question, yes? Please introduce yourself before you ask the question. Thank you, Lida.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm here as a former journalist and colleague of Martin, and now working for Prague Center for Media Skills. My question would be, it's quite obvious that we can't protect the security of journalists on an individual basis, just on an individual basis. So my question would be to you as employers more, and probably in the case of Freedom House, it's what as an employer, as a media house, are you doing for protecting your journalists, because it means structural and functional changes. So what are you doing?
My wonderful colleagues as well. So Czech TV, in terms of foreign correspondents and people that go to hostile environments, and so we offer online courses or physical courses for it's called HEST, which is hostile environment training. I went through one as well in London. This is the basic thing that can happen to people. It's not only about being able to make your way out of unpleasant situations. It's also first aid and all things that are involved in this. Whenever our correspondents, for example, now in Ukraine, go and are being deployed, we're in constant touch with them. They inform us where they go when they return, when they're on the front line. We want to know, every detail, where they go, whom they go with, and so on. They can call me. They can call anyone at TV 24/7. As regards protection of journalists here, it's a more delicate, I would say, because it's not as straightforward. You have different kinds of threats. You have different kinds of harassment that I had brought up a while ago. So we want to be there. We want to be there when they're being harassed. We want to call these politicians out loud, not publicly. We usually don't do that. But when something like that happens, we can talk to them informally and tell them, what, I think this is just going too far, and so on. We do that. It is not my job to be an activist. I'm a journalist. That's why, for example, we don't shame. I wouldn't shame Russia publicly on the show. I would say what Russia does and let people, make their own judgment. And I would say that most people that are sane would come to the same conclusion as I would. But these digital threats and online harassment and so on is something new. And sometimes we don't even know about this unless people tell us that they're facing this, right? Sometimes people are ashamed of showing, I received these tons of emails, pinpointing that and so on. And unless they tell us, we don't really know about this. So I think it's a constant process. We don't have a protocol for that yet, but we try to help every single individual when she or he gets into trouble. And the trouble may be subtle. It may not be as visible as a physical attack is, but we try to be there for them.
Thank you.
I can just add a couple things, which is about 3 to 4 weeks ago, we had a journalist on the front lines in Ukraine who was in the midst of covering a story. He stepped out of a vehicle. He was traveling with the Ukrainian military, and a mortar shell came and landed directly next to the vehicle. He suffered a very serious leg injury, and he probably would have died on the spot were it not for the fact that the camera operator who was with him that day had first aid training, which we require all of our frontline journalists to have. Increasingly, yes, there's all kinds of, and it's not just the front lines, you know, that type of thing is mandatory for anybody who's doing that type of reporting. But increasingly, I think this is, keeping our people safe is easily our top priority. And that takes on physical safety, protecting them in the online world, protecting them legally, HR, but another key part is mental health. I am incredibly concerned about our workforce and about the entire journalistic profession. We're subjected to a bombardment of images that will haunt us for the rest of our lives, some of them which are just popping into my brain as I say that. And I would say that I had a conversation with a physician in Ukraine during a recent trip that I made there, and he said that the darkest days for Ukraine will come the day after the war ends. As hateful and as awful as it has been, his concern is the mental health fallout of everything. I think we as a collective society have a real concern there. And the last thing I would say is where we keep our people safe in their workplaces is really critical. It's been nearly 30 years since we moved into the into Prague. And imagine the world looks a little bit different now than it did back then. We ask of the Czech government a great number of things. We have people from all around the world, some people who are difficult for places like foreign ministries to have to think about having journalists who perhaps grew up inside Iran or inside Afghanistan. But I will say that we have an excellent working relationship, especially with the Czech Foreign Ministry, who help us take care of all these people who are here working on behalf of Radio Free Europe.
Thank you. We have last few minutes, so I will take last two questions. There was a gentleman in the first row, and then another person with glasses in the fourth row, and that will be it, I'm afraid, because we have to wrap up soon.
Okay, my name's Bill Eldridge. I was with Radio Free Europe after the Munich move and Radio Free Asia. One of the things that I think we're suffering from is news is very personality oriented, but there's a lot of very fast data around the news business that needs to speed up more and more. And I think that perversely is putting journalists in danger because nobody believes anything. So now the journalists become important, they become the targets. Do you see the way forward to simplify the use of technology to make journalists' jobs easier? Like artificial intelligence and all of these hype things, but also just like we have editing consoles, you know, that's 20-year-old technology. Now we think about what are all the tools we need for 2024.
Thank you. I'll take the last question over there, and then we'll...
Good evening. I'm Andy from the Philippines. I'm a journalist from the Philippines and also an Erasmus student in journalism. So my question is, in 2010, for example, we talked about social media being like a catalyst for change, but now it moved to being a catalyst to being a disruptor. So do you think that emotions is the next battleground for journalism? I would like to build on what you mentioned about mental health. So that's my first question. If so, if you believe that emotions is the next battleground, uh, do you, for example, do so at least we can deal with this new battleground? Also for the audience and for journalists, like how can we protect ourselves amid this very hyperactive audiences, hyper emotive audiences? Thank you.
Thank you. There's really an interesting tension between the two questions, like the directions to the most sophisticated tools like artificial intelligence, and then to the deepest emotions and snake brain stuff, in our, cortex over there. So who wants to pick up any of the questions?
It's maybe surprising as I'm not representing any journalist, neither media nor the broadcaster, but it will give me actually a sneaky opportunity to answer partly also the question from Adriana, as we are not media organization. We are so-called fixers, but a little bit different ones. Usually we get in touch with journalists only when something bad happens. And that partly maybe also answers your question that, going back to the basics. And by basics, I really mean that when we are approached by the journalists from all around the world, we are asking very simple questions. For example, do you have a valid passport? What in case of the emergency, will be the country you will relocate? Do you have a valid visa? Do you have, some financial pillow, or your employer will provide you any assistance? And these are very simple things which at the beginning, maybe 5 years ago, I was afraid that we are traumatizing people who are asking us for different other assistance, and we're like, okay, let's go back to the basic, we understand your situation, we definitely assess it as an emergency, but we would like to ask you, what is your personal security plan if things will go even worse than they are now? And we realized that with these questions, we are actually not traumatizing them. We make them think about what is actually the situation they are right now, but from the very practical perspective. And it's also actually kind of calming effect that people are like, okay, I need to focus also on this practicalities. And that actually helps them to find the courage to continue working, because they already contacted someone who can, again, link them or connect them with other people, who can provide a legal assistance. So I would say that, the journalists, they very often feel abandoned, and they feel that, they do not have any support. But it is really about, these networks. And Gabriela mentioned Journalists in Distress Network. That's the network of over 26 organizations. There's also ACOS Alliance, and we're not doing the best job, because quite often when we speak with journalists, they're like, oh, I've never heard about JID or ACOS. And we're like, yeah, that's probably our failure, but here we are, here's the website. These are organizations you can consult in advance, when you will be expecting that your investigation will be more impactful than you thought, or that this particular article will bring more attention than you even expected. So these are very practical things. And for the bigger ones, as AI and others, I will give the floor to gentlemen.
Well,
will we still need journalists in some time?
Yes. Yes, we will. Journalists still have a real value. The last question came from somebody who is a journalism student, and I applaud your efforts. It's a noble calling, and we do need journalists. One of the things that, to the question about technology, we have a fundamental responsibility, I think, to try to address this trust issue, or trying to regain trust. And one of the things that I think actually works is drawing attention to how much work is done. When an investigative journalist can say, here's our story, and oh, by the way, here are the, we conducted 47 interviews on the record with different people. When we can, like when we're in school and you have to do a complex math problem, they tell you to show your work so that they can see that you actually have some base of knowledge. I think we as journalists can do a better job at telling people all of the work that has gone into stories. There's been some really controversial reports recently that ProPublica in the United States has done recently about Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. And yet, this is the kind of story that's a lightning rod. As soon as you say you're going to do an investigative expose about a Supreme Court justice, you can imagine in a divided country, people are going to line up and start going after it. Something interesting happened on this one. ProPublica took a great deal amount of time to say, these are all of the steps we did in investigating this very complicated story. And that's, I think we hurt ourselves because sometimes we go, everything gets shortened. Sound bites that should be, well, sound bites, it's a terrible phrase. Every interview gets cut down into 7-second chunks. And so the sound bite becomes, yes, I'm outraged. Doesn't really mean anything. But we've done that to ourselves, quite honestly. Stories have become shorter, the commercial pressures, we gotta go. Well, why? Especially in the digital age. So take the extra time to do it. But I also think technology can help us do that. We can keep better databases, we can share the information that we've gathered and put that work out there. Increasingly, it's when we're now designated as an undesirable organization by Russia, that means that they can come after us, or they can come after the people who actually appear on camera. And so maybe their work becomes a little more anonymous, but the stories still have to contain this some sort of insight into all of the work that went into it. Maybe, just maybe, for the people who are open-minded, you might be able to rebuild some trust.
Thank you. It's very interesting, and it also sounds partially as a recipe for journalists for the future to share more with their audience, to show part of their work and what it takes and what's behind and what's the process. Because it may be really fascinating to the audience, the entire, story behind the story. Martin, would you like to take up any of those questions and maybe add a bit of a conclusion, like when we, spoke today about safety of journalists, what would you think of your, task for the upcoming months and years in, taking care of your team in the Czech television, taking care of yourself and taking care of the profession?
Well, you just named it. That's it. That's what we have to do. On the trust thing, I totally agree with Stephen. BBC has come up with an idea of, it's called BBC Verify, I think about 2 years ago, and it's now being quite prevalent, where they explain how they come to stuff, right? They don't only say what happened, but they say, how do we know that really happened? Where do these videos come from? How can we tell you that it's really true? And it's interesting, it's now picking up on their online, and it's because trust is of utmost value to all of us. If we lose this, we're not going to be able to regain it anytime soon. And trust in media is eroding, that's a fact. On AI, I think it can very easily replace repetitive work that we do and save our staff some time to be more creative. If that happens, I'm not sure, but I hope it's the case, then it will be a good use of AI. again, we have this debate, and there's probably a difference between commercial media and then maybe public service or RFE, I believe as well. I think we stand for the same values, so I consider RFE to be a public service medium as well. Commercial media will be inclined and tempted to use AI-generated images, for example, because they will be for free, or almost for free, right? Let's say you do an article on mountains, right? You will not be pushed to buy a picture that someone had taken and someone had to go somewhere and take it, but you can just, ask the artificial intelligence to produce it for you. If that's the case, it will be almost for free. But if we do that, then we're not going to be able to tell our audience, you know what, this is exactly what happened. This is reality. If we do it once, they will ask this question, how can we trust you again? Well, you did it once. This was not the real mountain in Switzerland. This was something artificially made. And you're on a downhill slope. That will just not, stick well with you. So we have to think twice where we use AI and where not to use this. And on the mission or the journalism as such, I think that's we have to tell young people, especially young people, that journalism is the greatest profession that they can go for, right? If we tell them, this is going to be difficult, you're not going to be able to sleep well, you're going to have mental issues, you're going to get attacked in Ukraine and so on. Yes, and that's true, by the way. We have to tell them that as well, but maybe wrap it in a pink, in a box, then they're not going to go for that. If we tell them that it's the best profession to serve the world, it's a service, it will take your health away, but you're there to be there for the audience that has not the privilege of being able to be there, then I think journalism is not going to die. I hope not. Look at Slovakia, what's happening now with their public service media. This is exactly an example that democracy and stable and good journalism and independent journalism is interlinked. If one of them fails, that the other will not be there. It's really interwoven. One of the I would say, security official in the Czech Republic, okay, he told me that there's two basically pillars of democracy in every country. That's the intelligence services and independent media. I wouldn't go as far as saying that, but I would definitely kind of defend the public service part of it, of the media.
You would put public service media first?
No, I just can't talk about the role of intelligence services in this comparison. I think both of them are important, both of them should be there. I just think there's more pillars of democracy than those two.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to wrap up because we're already 15 minutes late. I would like to sincerely thank Stephen Kapus, Lida Vackova and Martin Rzezniczek for joining me today. The message I have for you is probably, if you don't want the secret services to take care of everything, care about free media, because this is the second pillar you definitely need to keep democracy and rule of law in your countries. Thank you very much. I ask you for a round of applause for my guests. Big thanks also to our audience online, and please do not stop thinking about how to make your journalists and your media safer and better service to you. Thank you very much and have a good night.